I just want to make this point for people that are watching. Like, we don't have to all agree on everything. You know,
Sure.
there are people that I respect in the dog world that I don't, that there are certain things I don't agree with,
Hmm.
but they're showing their work, they get results, and they're doing it.
Hmm.
So this idea that people see like it has to be an all or nothing thing, I
Hmm.
just want people to get out of this way of thinking of like just because two people can sit down and have a respectful dialogue doesn't mean we don't have differences or disagreements in how we do things.
Sure.
So, and that doesn't mean we can't respect each other. And so I just want people to take that
Absolutely.
away. Like
Yeah.
there are things we do very differently, Dale, but the
Sure.
understanding of these problems is the same. And
Yeah.
so I just want people to take that away that we might not do everything the same way, but that doesn't mean we can't all sit in a room and discuss these ideas.
Like a lot of things, when you get into sports and different kinds of trades, like
Hmm.
you have to kind of do the work, right? I mean,
Hmm.
they talk about this 10,000 hours to be an expert. Um, when it comes to something like work handling dogs, you can't really get that through a screen.
No.
That those 10,000 hours wouldn't count. You have to work the dog. The
Hmm.
other thing I'd like to say when it comes to the method and specifically with the leash and the baseline is like, for example, we've I've been really following Kevin at Anti Dog Trainer, and you had him on not too long ago.
Hmm.
It's a good example of it would make virtually no sense to say, hey Kevin, go put Goose up on a baseline and kind of put this put this demand on Goose for no reason, his dog, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's painfully obvious that he has a seriously deep connection with Goose.
Yeah.
Goose is following Kevin. Period. The end.
Yeah.
So it would. So you don't need to run over to Dale and say, "Hey, Dale, I need help." Kevin doesn't need help. Kevin's
Well,
relationship is
yeah,
solid,
but
and
here's
that's
the
it.
problem, Christian. But here's the problem. That's part of the issue here. I talk about like Ivan Belanoff being the example. There's certain dynamics there where like, and that's kind of the tricky thing here
Yeah,
is like you could have a very it's like Ivan Belanoff, a dog of high level, but the problem here is that he brings a dog in, and that's why my loose leash kind of example. I put that video up. You don't know. I mean, if you start there with if that's not brought into alignment, influence and
right,
control the way I described, you don't know. I mean, the thing
right.
is, you could have, and then you're not, because the question I had put up on my Facebook page, I put it right up there for everyone to see, is that's really the foundational question. What is the criteria these trainers are
Right.
using to establish that the perception of these dogs are changing the way they think they are within the framework of response?
Well, I mean, Dale, I have my own criteria that I use to determine whether or not the perceptions of a dog is changing, but it's not through the framework of a response because I don't use motivating agents the way a lot of other people do. Like, I don't use food, I don't use toys, I don't bribe dogs, I'm the motivator. So everything to me comes down to the social interaction. So it depends on the dog in question, it depends on the issue we're trying to work through, it depends on the owner. So if all the dog needs is some rules and boundaries to follow and there's a lack of structure in the home, well, the criteria for me then is if we implement the necessary boundaries and we implement the necessary structure, and maybe there are times where the dog engages in a power struggle because now we're adding things that weren't there before, and we're taking a more authoritative approach. It then comes down to, will the owner do what's necessary to win those power struggles, to take control from the dog back into your own hands? But the criteria should be, is the dog showing respect to the rules consistently? Is the dog respecting the boundaries consistently? Is the dog adhering to my leadership direction and guidance consistently? Is the dog challenging me? Is the dog engaging in power struggles? Is the dog trying to make demands of me? Are we seeing a diminishment of the behaviors that I was called for? And is that diminishment consistent over a long period of time? And then, of course, the state of mind of the dog. Is the dog now becoming more relaxed, more calm, more confident, more balanced? I have my own way of discovering or assessing or testing a dog. This comes down to, we have different philosophies about what a leash represents, how to use a leash, and so I don't think putting a leash on a dog is the litmus test for discovering whether or not, or discovering the truth of how a dog perceives me or its relationship to the environment. See, this also comes down to, like, I've heard Dale say, you know, you won't know until you put the leash on. Like, how does a dog respond when you use influence and control through a leash? But usually, here's how it goes for me. A dog will, so yeah, dogs that aren't agreeable to the leash, when you take the leash off, or they'll try to fight to get off the leash, and then they're taken off and they're running away. Or they'll play this little game of, you know, fuck you, you can't catch me. But they're not going to let you catch them, and they're not going to walk back to you. They're going to take off and do whatever the fuck they want to do, because now they have the freedom to do it. So by the very nature of you putting a leash on a dog, you are taking control of the dog. Maybe the leash is loose, but you still have control over the dog to a certain extent. But to me, the litmus test is taking the leash off. That the dog has the freedom to run away if it wants, or it can choose to follow you. So at that point, that to me is the litmus test. Is let's take all the tools off and see what the dog does. Yeah, I have other ways of revealing the truth of how a dog perceives itself, or perceives me, and how much control that dog actually has gained through the relationship it has with its owners and its environment. To me, the leash isn't a huge litmus test for this. It can definitely reveal things to you, but I don't think it reveals everything.
What? Pick up the key. She leaving again? Yeah. Ask her right now.
No trainers can answer that. But that connects though to what I'm saying about influence and control being reconciled, coming in the way I described, to provide not just the assessment part of it, but the change part of it. Because if your starting point is with a loose leash or influence and control aren't defined that way, you don't know. But here's the thing, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, his dog group could be at a very high level, but that can't be said for all trainers and all dogs, even with himself.
No.
Because that's a conversation he wants to have with me, saying, Dale, you know what, you know, so that tells me right away, you know, okay, there's, you know, how do you know? Because, you know, and then here's the other problem is then that has to transfer over. Say if you have a board and train situation, that your idea of it, because now as a trainer, right, it's not coming the way I described, that transfers over to the owner, because that dog's got to go back to the owner.
Right. And
then for them, right, and that's the point I'm making. See, these trainers don't even consider certain things. Then for them to generate what has to happen in reverse course, they can be stalled out because of based on what that loose leash method or it's not coming in the way I described. And then everything washes out. I mean, how common is it for these board and trains to wash out so quickly for people? And people, then what? Oh, it must be something wrong with the dog. I can't get that. I can't get just leave the remote collar on 24/7. You know what I'm saying? All this stuff.
Or I don't know if Dale remembers this, but I had told him I don't do board and trains. Now, I will take a dog in occasionally to work on it for a couple days if there are some severe circumstances or if it's necessary. But I don't do board and trains, and in fact, I advocate against them because most of the time, this is the problem. You return the dog back to the owner, and if there's not education given to the owner about how to maintain things or what was done to get the dog to a certain point, it's all going to fall apart. Dale calls it a loose leash method, but I don't think the leash being loose is a method in and of itself. I have a whole philosophy around using a leash, which we will get into, but the majority of my work is going to people's homes and educating them how to build this relationship with them, and a lot of times is leash work. And so it's showing them how to use the leash correctly to get your dog to follow you in the way that you want it to, and then we can eliminate all these problems people typically have on the leash with the pulling and the reactivity and anxiousness and a dog just doing whatever the hell it wants and not paying attention to you, so on and so forth. So in this case, the way Dale uses a leash is something I disagree with, and that I don't personally. In 15 years of working with dogs, I've never used a leash in this way. And I want Dale to understand that it's not that I don't understand why you do this. It's just I disagree with the methodology. See, the way Dale uses the leash comes down to influence and control, right? But let's look at the definitions of these words. So first, let's look at the definition of dominance, right? The definition is power and influence over others. And the definition of influence is the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. Now, the definition of power is the ability or capacity to do something or act in a particular way. But now the definition directly related to influence says the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Now, the definition of control, the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. The definition of control is the exact same as one of the definitions of power. The definition of influence isn't that far off. Now, when we're talking about dominance, you cannot have dominance without power and influence. The power and the influence leads to the control. So, I'm not here to, this obviously isn't a personal thing with Dale, and I'm not here to throw rocks at Dale or his methodology or anything like that. I'm simply here to share my philosophy on using a leash and how I use a leash to work through behavioral issues and how what the leash represents to me, because the goal for me is to be able to remove the tools from the dog. So I have a much different way of looking at something like a leash, because to me the leash is a means to an end. And while the leash is a tool of control in and of itself, to me it's also much more a tool of communication than anything else. Now, one of the things I've learned from Brandon Fouché that has been very helpful is Brandon Fouché has said it's better to communicate to a dog what you don't like rather than, positive reinforcement, something humans created. But the animal world, you don't see dogs running around handing out treats. You don't see lions running around handing out treats, gorillas, silverbacks, whatever. The animal world, it's much more, communication is all centered around telling the subordinates what you don't like. Everything in between means it's acceptable. If I'm the most dominant dog and I'm making rules for the other dogs and I communicate to another dog that, hey, I don't like that, and then the other dog respects it, all that time and everything that happens in between, the next time I tell a dog I don't like something, means that all of that in between is acceptable. This is very clear communication to a dog, where as long as they know where the rules are, what the boundaries are, what the limits are, what is not acceptable, then it's very easy to understand what is acceptable. So I approach using a leash in this same way, where to me the leash should be loose and relaxed. Now, please do not confuse this with me giving the dog all the leash in the world. That's not what I mean. I'm saying I only give dogs as much leash as they can handle, but the leash they get is loose and relaxed. And then when I need to tell the dog I don't like something, or when I need to guide the dog, I apply some pressure, or I apply the tension to communicate to the dog that I don't want you to do this. And then I release that pressure or tension when the dog adheres to whatever it is I'm trying to communicate. So to me, it's a binary system. It's very clear communication to the dog. It's concise. It makes sense. Because now the dog understands, okay, everything's good when I don't feel any pressure, but the minute I feel some pressure or some tension, I know, okay, I need to pay attention, because that feeling, I want the feeling to mean something to the dog. If there's constant tension, to me it's like static in a radio signal where I can't hear what's being said because there's nothing but tension. It's nothing but static. Well, I want the tension to represent something in the dog's mind. So if the tension is constant, then how am I going to give clear boundaries with the leash? Or how am I going to clearly communicate to the dog that I don't like something? So that way the dog understands what is acceptable. And I think this comes down to, me and Dale have different ideas of what control and influence really are. To me, influence comes from the way you communicate with the dog. It comes from the interaction. It comes from the power and the strength in the way you communicate. Because remember, the definition of power is the ability or capacity to do something or act in a particular way. Or in the relation to influence, it's the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Right? So there needs to be power in my communication. There needs to be strength in my communication. That leads to the influence, because my goal is to influence the dog from the inside out, not from the outside in. It seems to me like the way Dale uses the leash is trying to influence the dog from the outside with, say, the choke chain and the tension, and that's his idea of influence control. No, I want to influence the dog internally because of the way I communicate, because I'm tapping into the instinctual part of the dog, the social part of the dog that understands what it is I'm saying. I'm tapping into that part of the dog that says, I gotta follow the most dominant figure in my life, or the most dominant figure in my immediate surroundings, and that's going to be me. Using the leash to provide guidance, and I don't believe in this idea that you should yank on the dog's neck to punish it and correct it and blah blah blah. No, I'm often very gentle with the leash because I don't need much force to influence the dog in the right way. And that's how you know you've achieved a very high level, when I can use the leash in such a subtle way, but I can get the dog to respond in exactly the way I need it to understand what it is I'm trying to say. So now the dog's following me in the right way, and I can begin to take measures and test the dog to take the leash and the collar off. And now the dog goes through a process of earning the freedom that it deserves.